Buon pomeriggio. Welcome to Professor Atherton and Honegger. Siamo arrivati all'ultimo incontro del nostro convegno Tolkien, l'uomo, il mito, la storia, dal titolo History and Mythology, la ricerca oltre le Alpi. Pronti per immergerci nella storia medievale e nella mitologia che tanto hanno ispirato la creazione del mondo di Arda. Vi ricordo che se avete domande e siete connessi via streaming, potete scriverci tramite mail all'indirizzo studenti.unimi.tolkien@gmail.com. Ma senza ulteriori indugi, passo a presentarvi il primo dei due relatori, Mark Atherton. Mark Atherton è Senior College Lecturer di Lingua e Letteratura Inglese a Regent's Park College, University of Oxford. Dal 2016 al 2017 è stato Visiting Professor di Studi Inglesi Medievali all'University of Düsseldorf. È autore di There and Back Again, J.R.R. Tolkien and the Origins of the Hobbit. Ha anche scritto pubblicazioni sulla filologia e lo studio del linguaggio nel XIX secolo e sulla storia della letteratura altomedievale. Alcune delle sue più recenti pubblicazioni: The Making of England, Complete Old English, The Battle of Malden, War and Peace in 10th Century England. Oggi con noi con un intervento dal titolo The Making of Middle Earth, A New History for England. To you.
Thank you very much. Can you all see the screen? My topic today is The Making of Middle-earth, A New History for England. And I would like to look at how Tolkien came to be. He was a professor of philology, and how did he come to be a famous writer? How did this come about? What were the interactions between his work for the university, his philology, and his writing? First of all, it was for children, it was The Hobbit, and then later his adult fiction, The Lord of the Rings, writings. One of the key ideas I think we can use as a link, as a connector between his philology and his fiction is this word adventure. And this is a scene from The Hobbit. And you can see on the right-hand side, the wizard talking to Bilbo Baggins, and Bilbo Baggins does not wish to be disturbed. He says, "We are plain, quiet folk. We are ordinary people and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things make you late for dinner." The Hobbit is all about how a comfortable, bourgeois, bachelor, scholarly type of person is taken out of his comfortable life and thrown into an adventure. And adventure here has its modern meaning. But let us have a look now at the professor himself. Here is Tolkien in his study. In some ways, he is a bit like a hobbit. He described himself as a hobbit, very comfortable life that he led. But he had his adventures, and I want to explore some of those. Some of those were real life adventures, others were adventures into the world of literature. At the end of The Hobbit, we have the following conversation. The Hobbit, of course, has had many experiences by the end of the story, and he presents a splendid necklace, piece of jewelry, to the king of Elfland. And the king says, "In what way have I earned such a gift, O Hobbit?" said the king. And Bilbo is rather confused. "Well, I thought don't you know that some little return should be made for your hospitality? He had, of course, spent quite a few weeks hiding in the palace of in Mirkwood. I mean, even a burglar has his feelings. I have drunk much of your wine and eaten much of your bread. I will take your gift, Bilbo the Magnificent, said the king gravely, and I name you elf friend and blessed. I'm going to repeat that again. It's very formal English, isn't it? And I name you elf friend and blessed. May your shadow never grow less, or stealing would be too easy. Farewell. Then the elves turned towards the forest, and Bilbo started on his long road home. So he is returning from his adventure, and the elves are returning to the forest. It's not symbolic writing, but you can see just a touch of symbolism in this. Bilbo is returning home to his normal life, and the elves return into the forest of magic, the other world, if you will. But notice the mixture of styles in Tolkien's writing. It's a mixture of the modern, the informal, the everyday. Well, I thought, don't you know, said Bilbo, some little return should be made for your hospitality. This is modern English, rather informal and colloquial. And the king himself, from the world of the elves, speaks in a more formal, grave manner. He uses the word gift rather than present. Present is what we give our friends at birthdays. Gift is a much more formal, even slightly old-fashioned word. Present came into the English language from French, as far as I remember. Gift is an old English word which has been in the language much longer. Of course, it's connected with the verb, the old verb to give. So there are these kind of levels of formality and informality, of register, of archaic and modern, which you find in Tolkien's writings. And what does he say to Bilbo? He gives him, almost in return for the gift, he gives him a name. I name you elf friend and blessed. Now I want to show you where that name actually comes from and explain a little bit of the background to that in the rest of my talk, as we explore how Tolkien came to write The Hobbit, first of all, and then The Lord of the Rings afterwards. Because elf friend is not actually a modern English idea. It goes back more than 1,000 years, probably 1,500 years, to this, or even older. And this is the word for elf friend in the Old English language. In other words, if you go back down the generations, 1,000 years, 1,500 years, you come across this form, alf winna. And elf means elf in the Anglo-Saxon language, in Old English. And winner is an old poetic word for friend. We still have it in one or two names today. Edwin is a name which still sometimes occurs. Godwin, perhaps, but it's not so common, is it? And so Alfwinner means elf friend, and Adwinner means blessed friend, prosperity friend. So if we go back to our scene from The Hobbit, and the Elf King says, I name you elf friend and blessed. This is a very hidden philological allusion in Tolkien's writing, which I don't suppose everybody catches, because it echoes this name in Old English, which Tolkien was fascinated by. Where did this name, elf friend, Alfwinner, come from. And one of the ways of explaining his telling of the story of the Hobbit, first of all to his children, and then writing it up as a story to be published, is that he wanted to compose a story that would explain this word, Alfwine. How is this possible that it was very common in the early medieval period in England, especially among the nobility, to have names of this kind. Dithematic names, they are called. They're members of the royal family, the West Saxon nobility, all had names of this type. So Tolkien is then going into history and even going back into prehistory in order to invent, and I use the word invent almost in its etymological sense of finding stories to explain words, finding stories to explain names. This is a theme that you find in several critics who have written about Tolkien's fiction. And the most famous critic, I can't blow my own trumpet, the most famous critic on this is Tom Shippey, who wrote the book The Road to Middle Earth. And I have tried to follow in Tom Shippey's footsteps with my own book, which looks at the origins of the Hobbit. Let's explore a little bit more now. Let's go to this word adventure. In the Middle Ages, from the 11th century or the 12th century through until, so from about 1100 to 1500, this was the use of the word adventure in Middle English, in medieval English, as used in England. It didn't have a D in it, it was aventure, aventure. But of course, it's connected. It comes from French into the English language because of the influence of the royal court, the Norman conquest, the history of England. And aventure is something a bit like a mission. It is a task that you take on, especially in medieval romances, especially the knight, the chivalric knight takes on an adventure, an aventure, as he calls it. And this is the use of the term in the Middle Ages. Then the D creeps in, because of course it comes from Latin, etymologically, it comes from Latin advent. It is something that comes to you, something that happens to you, and you have to respond to it. This is the origin of the word adventure in modern English. And perhaps nowadays it has different connotations to the rather grand, chivalric, Arthurian meaning of aventure, which it had in medieval English literature. So was this word new? Well, yes, it was new in the Middle Ages because this word did not exist in the English language before that. But if we go to Beowulf, the most famous Old English epic, we find that the concept definitely existed. And the word in Old English for the same idea was Sith. Sith. Beowulf's Sith means Beowulf's adventure, Beowulf's task, Beowulf's mission. Beowulf undertakes a mission to rid the kingdom of Denmark of monsters. And there are many parallels to be found between the story of Beowulf and the story of the Hobbit and the stories that you find in the Lord of the Rings. And I do not have time today to go into too many of those parallels, but they are certainly there. For example, just to give you one, the story of the Hobbit breaking into the dragon's mountain stealing a cup from the dragon's treasure, which enrages and angers the dragon. This is an idea which is taken straight out of Beowulf and adapted for the story of The Hobbit by Tolkien. Of course, was a specialist in in Beowulf, and he lectured on Beowulf, and his lectures have been studied, and the different editions have been carefully teased apart, and you can read Michael Drout's edition of Beowulf and the Critics by J.R.R. Tolkien. You can also buy J.R. Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, along with a very interesting commentary where we notice many parallels between The Lord of the Rings and Beowulf, even in the way Tolkien was lecturing on the poem Beowulf when he was a professor. So here we have The Hobbit. As I say, it was, first of all, he told it to his children, and only later was he was persuaded by his friends to publish it as a book. And this is a story of Tolkien's life, really. He was reluctant to finish his projects, to finish his adventures, if you like. Here's the first edition of The Fellowship of the Ring. If you have this book and you don't want it, maybe you could give it to me. I'd be happy to take it off you. Tolkien, of course, was very interested in nature, in the botanical garden in Oxford. Another area of influence is the connection between nature and folklore, Scandinavian folk tales, German folk tales. All this was of interest to Tolkien as a professional scholar, as a philologist, but also in his spare time. When The Hobbit was first published, they compared, this was in 1937, they compared Professor Tolkien to another Oxford professor who lived in the 19th century. His name was Lewis Carroll, and he published a book called Alice in Wonderland, which you probably know. And Lewis Carroll was a mathematician. Tolkien was a philologist. The parallel, this is what the newspaper critic said, was a professor of a very difficult subject decides to write a children's story and to include in his story aspects of his work to make it more accessible to a wider readership. So that's one element, I think, also of how Tolkien came to write The Hobbit. But his own childhood was also massively important. Let me show you just a few scenes from his childhood. This is a place near Birmingham, an old mill where he and his brother used to play. If you compare a picture painted by Tolkien from The Hobbit, Hobbiton, across the water, you can see the mill where he and his brother used to play. You can see the village where he used to live. His childhood experiences influenced the way he later wrote. When he was a young boy, he wrote a story about a dragon. He called it, he said, The Story of the Green Great Dragon. And his mother, whom unfortunately he later became an orphan, but his mother was still alive at this time, and she corrected his English. Think about his English. The Green Great Dragon, the story of the Green Great Dragon. The adjective word order is not correct. Normally we say a big red car. So you should say a great green dragon. This is the order, size before color. Tolkien was only young, I think, if I remember right, 6 or 7 years old, but he started thinking about language at this point. And his interest in language, as I'm sure you know, was absolutely essential for his career as a philologist, as a literary critic, and also as a writer. He was born in South Africa, not because he was South African. His parents were English, but they lived for 4 years in South Africa, and they traveled back when he was 4 years old back to England, or at least he and his mother and his brother did. And they used to spend holidays by the sea. And the fascination of the sea was something else which influenced Tolkien. Before he went to university, he at the age of 18, he traveled to Switzerland. This was one of the adventures of his early career. He experienced a storm in the mountains in Switzerland. And you will find in most of his important books, certainly in The Hobbit and in The Lord of the Rings, there is a scene of crossing the mountains during a storm. This was a very influential experience for him. He went to university in Oxford. This happens to be where I work. I want to show you, to finish off, a few images from Oxford to give you a sense of what academic life was like for Tolkien in the 1920s and the 1930s at the University of Oxford. It's a very traditional university, as I'm sure you know. Many of the buildings are medieval, and each student belongs to a college. There is no choice. You have to belong to a college. So you have two memberships, really, as a student. As any student, you have your faculty, your department or faculty, the same as any university in the world. But you also belong to a college, and you live in the college, and the colleges are not organized by faculty or subject of study. They are just organized in a more mixed way. So you belong to a college a bit like a society or a fraternity or a kind of club. And you can do your sport there. You have a kind of identity with the college. And Tolkien attended Exeter College, and half the teaching that he was given in college, and the other half was in the faculty. In the faculty, they had the big lectures. In the college, they had the smaller groups, the tutorials. Often it was just the student and the professor for the tutorial. So it's a very intensive education that he had, where he came to know the professors very well who taught him. And that has changed a little, but it's similar even today. One big difference today is Oxford University is mixed, men and women, but in Tolkien's day, most of these colleges were men only. It was a very male society. If you think about The Hobbit just for a second, from the point of view of the characters, how many female characters are there in The Hobbit? Please write your answers on a postcard and send them to me later. If you can find any, I will have to send you a prize, because I can't think of any really. These experiences were formative, but it was living together with many students, even today, is a very intellectually stimulating time. And old buildings, it's atmospheric, all this fed into Tolkien's imagination. Cloisters, halls. How many scenes are there in Tolkien's writing which are set in a large dining hall where people are guests of a special character. There are many scenes like this in The Hobbit. There are several scenes like this in The Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien even invented a word for hospitality, which he thought should have existed but did not exist anymore. It's a little bit like the German word for hospitality, Gastfreundschaft, which means friendliness towards your guest. And Tolkien's word, which he based on Old English and perhaps a little bit on Old Norse, is guest kindliness. If the Norman conquest had not taken place and history had been different, maybe in the English language we would say guest kindliness rather than hospitality. And maybe for speakers of English, this is a richer kind of word. It explains itself better to the English mind, perhaps. This was the kind of idea that fired Tolkien's imagination. Kind is also connected with nature and being natural. What kind of thing is this? What nature of thing is this? The old word kind meant nature. So essentially then Tolkien's world is and Tolkien's fictional world is a mixture of many influences from his childhood, from his own experiences, but essentially it is a philologist finding a way of publicizing, making of interest to a wider readership his own interest in the history of language and the history of England. And judging by the success of The Lord of the Rings, he almost succeeded in his aims. I think I've had my half an hour or maybe 25 minutes. So I think at that point, I'm going to finish my talk and hand over to Thomas. And I believe we're going to have some question time and time for discussion later in this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. So we shall lead to Professor Honegger. Professor Honegger, pardon. Tiene un PhD all'University of Zurich, dove ha anche insegnato antico e medio inglese. È autore di From the Phoenix Chanticleer, Medieval English Animal Poetry e Introducing the Medieval Dragon. Oltre alle pubblicazioni su animali, veri e fantastici che siano, e su Tolkien, ha scritto anche di Chaucer, Shakespeare e sul romanzo medievale in genere. Infatti il suo secondo PhD si è focalizzato sull'interazione tra gli amanti nella finzione narrativa medievale e dal 2002 è professore di studi inglesi medievali alla Friedrich Schiller University a Jena, in Germania. Oggi è con noi con un intervento su Imrahil's Vambraces or Tolkien's Other Middle Ages. To you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, very pleased to be at least virtually in Milano. So welcome everybody. Hello Roberto, I've seen you before. Yeah. So let me talk about Imrahil's. Yes. So where is it here? Imrahil's Vambraces. Yes. Here we go. Yeah. Good. If you want to read the paper from which this talk is kind of extracted, you can find it online in the Journal of Tolkien Research. It is actually quite a nice journal, and you can browse. You find many articles freely downloadable that are of interest. Now, Imrahil's Vambraces, I've chosen the title to ask the following question and to try to find an answer. Why are there no knights in Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age? So in the time when the Lord of the Rings takes place? Or actually, are there some knights, knights in plate armor like that, and we simply haven't noticed them? Now, looking for clues, I came across Imrahil's vambrace, and especially, well, Imrahil's bright burnished vambraces. Now, what is a vambrace? A vambrace, here you see it, is a kind of a guard. It's part of the armor that protects your forearm. We have vambrace, which is the forearm, and we have rear brace, which is the upper part of the arm. So usually they look like that, and they are made of, well, metal, usually, I say. Now, so that is a first kind of indication that we do have armor that would be connected to plate armor in Middle-earth at the end of the Third Age. Now, I've been looking further, and of course, Imrahil's vambrace play an important part when he finds Eowyn, who is severely wounded after having done away with the Lord of the Nazgul. And he then asks the Rohirrim, who think that she is dead, "Are there no leeches among you? This woman is still alive." And to prove it, he puts, and now I have to go to the next picture, he puts his bright burnished vambrace that was upon his arm before her cold lips, and behold, a little mist was laid on it, hardly to be seen. Nowadays, the doctors, you would use a mirror and put it in front of a patient's nose to see whether he or she is still breathing. Of course, Imrahil didn't bring along a mirror to the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, but he had his brightly burnished vambrace. Now, that, of course, would join in with the following. When Imrahil comes to Minas Tirith with his men, we get the following description. "And last and proudest, Imrahil, Prince of Dol Amroth, kinsman of the Lord, with gilded banners, bearing his token of the ship and the silver swan, and a company of knights in full harness, riding grey horses," and so on. So here we have another important word belonging to chivalry and knighthood, knights in full harness. However, we have to be very careful when we're dealing with terms and with words. As Mark has shown before, Tolkien was very, very careful about the use of words. So the best thing is, of course, when you go back to the Oxford English Dictionary, or in Tolkien's time, this would have been the New English Dictionary, for which he worked at the beginning of his career, and you check what do they say about vambrace and harness. When do they occur for the first time in the English language? They are, of course, loan words from French, vambrace. And we find them, the first instances of vambrace and harness, mostly in the first half of the 14th century onwards. So it's not the early Middle Ages, it's rather towards the high and the late Middle Ages that we have the use of these words as reference. Of course, it doesn't tell us yet what kind of thing it is, but the word that's important is mostly used from 1330 onwards. There is now a certain controversy in the Tolkien community whether the vambrace or vambraces could be of another material than metal, as you would think. So in 216, Martinez was putting forward the proposal that the vambraces need not be metal, but could be polished leather. So you have two options: either they are polished leather or they are polished metal. Now, why is it important to decide whether they are leather or metal? If you go for metal, the kind of implication is that the rest of the armor is also metal, and you're veering towards the full plate armor. And the use of vambrace, and especially harness, from the 14th century onward, of course, kind of pushes you in that direction. because we have the knights from the mid-14th century onwards. They were increasingly wearing plate mail, not the kind of the full heavy plate mail from the 15th, 16th century, but increasingly we find that type of plate mail worn by the knights. So if vambrace would be metal, then you could imagine that Imrahil has also other pieces of plate mail in his armor. And you could come up with a kind of a reconstruction of Imrahil and his men, something like that. So they look rather like kind of 15th century full plate mail knights. That. If you go for the leather bit, then of course you put things into a kind of an earlier stage of the development of armor. You probably have a combination of chainmail and maybe a few bits of plate mail, but very few, and leather bits, leather armor. So it would be maybe more something like that. So based on just that word vambrace and what the vambrace is made of, the scholars tend to differ what you can imply for the armor for Imrahil. Now, why is this important in a context of the discussion of Tolkien's knights and riders? Now, we do have, of course, people who ride horses, who are very good, who have something like a cavalry. That's, of course, the Rohirrim. But they are not knights in the meaning of our word, or in the meaning of the High Middle Ages, knights in full armor. The Rohirrim, they have a kind of armor, but it's mostly chainmail. And Tolkien described them once as they are a simpler and more primitive people living in contact with a higher and more venerable culture and occupying lands that had once been part of its domain. So what Tolkien describes here is a setting that is reminiscent of the, let's say, towards the end of the Roman Empire in the West. We have the Roman Empire, but it's beginning to lose its grip, and we have the new tribes, the Germanic tribes like the Goths, the Vandals, and so on, coming in. They are sometimes integrated. They settle in the lands that formerly belonged or still belong to the Roman Empire, and they become allies, a bit like the Rohirrim and Gondor. So we have riders. I wouldn't call them maybe knights in the medieval sense of the word, but we do have riders that are in Tolkien's world. And we see that contrast between this more primitive, younger culture, the Rohirrim, and the, let's say, older, more advanced culture, more sophisticated culture, the imperial culture of Gondor, with Minas Tirith as its capital. Now, Tolkien, when he kind of was creating, he didn't say a mythology for England, but that's not what Tolkien said. But as a shorthand, let's call it the mythology for England. When he started to write his kind of legendarium, he, of course, wanted to dedicate it to England, to his country. And looking for the sources of such a kind of a mythology, he was turning towards the Anglo-Saxons, and turning towards the Anglo-Saxons was, so to speak, he was in harmony with a lot of other scholars and intellectuals from the Victorian or even the earlier age onwards, who were looking for the sources of England in Anglo-Saxon times. And that meant before the Norman conquest, before 1066. So you're not looking to the knights in shining armor of the late Middle Ages or of the High Middle Ages, but he is rather looking before the Norman conquest, like the others before him. Oops, sorry. Yeah. If you're interested in the description of the Rohirrims and what they are based upon, I can point you to an essay, to a paper I've written about the Rohirrim, whether they are Anglo-Saxons on horseback. It's a bit more complicated. And I don't have the time to go into that, but the Rohirrim, I would say, are something like the people of Tolkien's heart. It's kind of the people that he could imagine are kind of the ancestors, the kind of poetic ancestors of England, this mythology of England. The core would be kind of with the Rohirrim. So they are actually kind of a poetic image of the Anglo-Saxons. And so it becomes clear that having a knight in plate armor would kind of disturb the picture, or at least it would take the focus away from the people that Tolkien wanted to focus on, namely the Rohirrim. So the Rohirrim are more like the Anglo-Saxons. And if we have another culture that is more like the knights of the High Middle Ages, they would kind of compete. And the knights of the High Middle Ages, they have a series of connotations, of associations, of ideas that Tolkien wanted to avoid. So imagining the Rohirrim in plate armor would be, I would say, quite wrong. Here we have actually an artist who tried, and I think it doesn't really fit. Definitely not. So, yeah. One thing that is connected with the ideal of the knight, with the chivalric ideals, is the ideal of the Victorian gentleman knight. And that, of course, is a very sophisticated ideal that includes certain religious and certain moral ideas. And so when you talk about a gentleman knight, you automatically have a set of values that probably Tolkien didn't want to associate with a more kind of, let's say, primitive original state. So having knights, chivalric knights around, doesn't really kind of help with this more primitive thing. The knight, especially in the form of St. George, killing the dragon and rescuing the damsel in distress, was a popular image in the Victorian age and later on. So it was almost omnipresent also, I think, during Tolkien's lifetime when he grew up with. He knew these images from also the Pre-Raphaelites, from the Victorian revival of the Middle Ages. So this is kind of the ideal of the knight that you would see in the paintings, in the adventure stories, and so on. And I think Tolkien didn't really kind of want that type of knight in his fiction. If possible, he wanted to avoid it. Another thing that is associated with the knights is, of course, courtly love. That you have a lady and that you serve that lady, that you woo her, that you do glorious deeds in her service, and eventually maybe she actually rewards you for this service. Now, Tolkien's colleague and friend, C.S. Lewis, he wrote a very important book, The Allegory of Love. And in there, he summarized the characteristics of courtly love as being secret. It must be secretive because it was, among other things, adulterous. So that your lady is usually a married lady. And so any kind of love relationship with such a married lady is, of course, adulterous. And Tolkien wasn't very kind of fond of that idea. You can imagine. He was a convinced Catholic, and his moral ideas didn't go with that. So he wanted to steer clear of this idea of courtly love. By the way, we do have at least 2 kind of courtly love couples in The Lord of the Rings. That's a bit more than the women in The Hobbit, which Mark pointed out, but it isn't very much. One, of course, is quite clear, and Peter Jackson made a lot of it. It's Arwen and Aragorn. Aragorn basically has to serve his time to gain the hand of Arwen. However, Tolkien put that love story into the appendices. So he didn't want it in the main bit. The main bit is about, kind of the fellowship. It's about war. It's about the ring and all that. And this love story, it's somewhere after page 1200, something like that. Peter Jackson, with a kind of a good feeling for audience impact, he of course took it into the main story again. And the one really kind of courtly love story that we have, and it is still in The Lord of the Rings, is of course between Gimli and Galadriel. You could say that's a love story, a courtly love story, according to Tolkien, because there is no question of kind of Gimli becoming adulterous with Galadriel. I don't think so. Yeah, maybe in some part of fan fiction, slash everything is possible, but I think definitely not in Tolkien's mind. Another problem that we have when we look at the shining knights in the Middle Ages, they are associated, they are bound up with religion. You have the Grail quest, King Arthur's Round Table, all the knights, they go out looking for the Grail. Even becoming a knight is a ritual that involves a lot of religion. You have to stay awake for a night in the church, you have to take a bath, and so on. So there is a lot of religious imagery or symbolism and a lot of religious kind of idealism going into the knighthood as we know it in the Middle Ages. And Tolkien is famous that he tried to keep religion out of The Lord of the Rings, at least organized religion. The book itself, of course, is a very religious book, but he tried to avoid the explicit religion. Okay, so you see, there are quite a few good reasons why Tolkien wanted to keep any associations with chivalry out of the picture. Nevertheless, I think that with Imrahil, we do have something like a remnant of elvish knighthood. However, the focus of the elvish knighthood is to the past. So Imrahil and his knights, they are not looking towards the future, because when you look from the Anglo-Saxons, from the Rohirrim, towards the future, you would see the French knights. The French knights would be kind of the ideal of the plate armored knights, the knight in shining armor. So they are there in the third age of Middle-earth, but they are in a very restricted place in Dol Amroth, and they are, so to speak, in decline. They are just the last remnants of a once kind of maybe flourishing chivalric culture. And what we have, what is the dominant thing, is of course the focus is more on the people like the Rohirrim, to some extent also on the Gondorians, but the focus here is really kind of on that kind of knights, the riders of Rohan, and that of course makes a difference in the ethos and in the associations that you have, and especially with Tolkien. He once said that the greatest calamity of English history was, of course, the Norman conquest. And England, the English language and the English culture would be quite different if the Norman conquest had not happened. And the Rohirrim, so to speak, are kind of a recreation of a people, if left alone with no Norman conquest, would develop then into kind of the English, so to speak. You would have to combine it with the hobbits, because of course we have the hobbit element too. But I was just focusing here on the chivalric ideal. Okay, and that brings me to the end of my presentation, and we are open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Se qualcuno ha delle domande, noi siamo qua per... meanwhile, if anyone has questions, I want to make a point just that came out of my mind, because in these days we are at the end of the meeting, and we have seen a lot of words that are important for Tolkien, that the word itself is important for Tolkien. So is nothing. It's something that we've seen yesterday, we've seen this morning, and we've seen also today, also with some practical things like the vampires. So it was fun. Just that. Se qualcuno ha delle domande, forse I have a question on that came for email. Good afternoon. I have a question for Mr. Honegger. Is it possible to say Tolkien was influenced by the Victorian concept of chivalry, in particular Tennyson's chivalry as presented in the Idylls of the King, for example?
Influenced insofar as he, I would say, wrote maybe in response to that. I think he didn't really, wasn't probably very fond of the way Tennyson presented things. I'm not aware that he commented on Tennyson explicitly. Maybe Mark can help me out with that. But in his letters or so, I don't think that he ever commented on Tennyson. He commented on Arthur, but not on Tennyson. But I can imagine that he was, when he was kind of maybe reacting to something like Tennyson. And Tennyson, of course, was very, very present in the Victorian area. He was the poet laureate. And you could say he started again the Arthurian tradition in England after a long, long pause. I mean, we have, of course, the Fairy Queen by Spenser, and then Milton was thinking about writing an epic about King Arthur, but he then opted for Paradise Lost, writing about God. You don't write about a king if you can write about God. Fair enough. And then we have for a long time no great literature about Arthur until Tennyson kind of took it up again and wrote his Idylls of the King. And so I can imagine very well that Tolkien was aware of that, knew it, and was kind of reacting to it. But yeah.
I think could I come in as well? I think if you think about Tolkien, what we used to think about Tolkien was that he wasn't interested in Arthurian literature, but some recent publications, which I'm sure Thomas Honegger you know as well, he wrote a poem called "The Fall of Arthur," which was published more recently. And suddenly we realized that Tolkien was interested in Arthur, and you could regard Tolkien's The Fall of Arthur as a kind of response to Tennyson. He must have known about Tennyson, but I agree with Thomas that you can't find any references to Tennyson, I don't think, in Tolkien's writings. But what is interesting about The Fall of Arthur is that as a poem, it's written in an alliterative style, like Beowulf, like an Old English poem. It's written in that kind of style. So it makes it feel, it gives it a different feel to Tennyson's Arthur or Malory's Arthur. And another thought, just while we're on the subject, is also a recent publication is Tolkien's Beowulf commentary. And he talked about the king of Denmark and his knights, and Beowulf and his knights. And I think what he's doing is he's trying to find, he doesn't want us to think of this society of Beowulf or even the Rohirrim as, okay, he used the word primitive, but in the 19th century, primitive was a more positive word, I think. He wants us to think of this as a society to admire with many qualities and ideals. And he can't find a good word for the horsemanship of the Rohirrim. So he uses words like chivalry and knights. And the same with Beowulf. He uses words like chivalry and knights to describe this literary tradition as well, in parallel with the French tradition, I think. Maybe Thomas wants to come back on that.
Yeah, and of course, Mark's new book, The Battle of Malden. Yeah. In there, of course, Tolkien, when he talks about Byrhtnoth, he also uses chivalry, I think, to criticize him. So he uses this term, which of course is not a term you would usually find in Old English. Definitely not. It's a French term. He applies it to well, Old English heroes, to Old English historical persons. That's a very kind of interesting use he makes. Yeah.
Ok, se non ci sono altre domande, sì, no.
Hi, I'm Lorenzo, and I have a question for both of you, because 2 years ago, before of the coronavirus, and I was speaking with one of my friend, a professor of the University of Florence, who teaches medieval history, and well, he speaking about Tolkien, he doesn't understand why the fantasy is born and is set in the Middle Ages. And he told me, I don't understand very well. Well, I will do to the conference that I will organize. But he's not here because he cannot, and so I would like to ask you this question, because effectively, if you think about a dragon, you will set next to a knight, and not during the Roman Empire, not next to at Versailles, or next to Gorbachev. Et donc, so why this? So, thank you.
I mean, I can start by, and maybe Thomas can think of some other thoughts. Tolkien was a professor. Tolkien was a professor of Anglo-Saxon, and then a professor of the English language. His speciality was medieval literature. He thought medieval literature has many qualities, and he wanted to find a channel, a means of showing a wider readership that medieval literature has many interests. And so I think the development was, first of all, he wrote a children's book, The Hobbit, and then he decided to try a similar style as an adult novel. In other words, how do you write an epic, a medieval epic, for a modern audience? And he chose to use the novel and the story of a quest or a journey as his way of doing that. He and his colleagues, he and C.S. Lewis, experimented with other kinds of fiction. Tolkien wrote a story called The Lost Road about dreaming of different periods of history. C.S. Lewis wrote science fiction. So they were interested in other kinds of stories, but they started where they were most familiar in the literature that they were teaching. And I think because it was so popular, many fantasy writers who have followed them later have also decided to use a medieval setting, or a kind of quasi-medieval setting for their stories. So it's the success of Tolkien and Lewis and a few other writers from this period that made the Middle Ages a popular setting for fantasy stories.
Maybe I could add to what Mark just said. Another aspect, I would see Tolkien in the Romantic tradition, and the representatives of the Romantic tradition, they were interested in the national identity. So, and the national identity is usually found in the Middle Ages. Because what do we have before? Before we have the classical antiquity, which is kind of this all European phenomenon. So if you talk about classical antiquity, it's all of Europe, basically, because we had the Imperium Romanum. Basically, you owned everything. I can, to my hosts here, you called the Mediterranean Mare Nostrum, kind of very kind of humble, our little sea, basically. And so you cannot really take the classical antiquity as a setting if you want to write a kind of a national literature. And of course, after the Industrial Revolution, that's also kind of bad. So what you were looking for is a time period before the technological industrialization, and that would be the Middle Ages. And so that's why we always end up in the Middle Ages, where things were, first of all, easier, things were kind of more clear-cut, and things were national, so to speak. So you could identify with that. That's, I see also one point that chimes in with what Mark said. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. We have another question.
A question to Mark. Mark, you spoke about the Aventoria that is also as in a French tradition, but what is the difference and with the cast and if there are some difference about this two kind of style?
Do you think you could? I found it a bit hard to hear that question. Could one of you repeat the question, please? It was a bit difficult to hear.
Shall I?
Yes, yes.
If you think you got it, Thomas, I don't mind. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. What is the difference between adventure?
Yes.
Quest, basically.
Oh, what is the difference between adventure and quest? Yes, I see what you mean now. They both come from French. You have adventure on the one hand and quest. They are similar. They both come into the language into the English language, post-Norman conquest through the influence of French culture and French literature. The quest, I suppose, has the idea of a search, of a goal towards at the end of your journey. And adventure is more, it's the beginning of your journey, really. In medieval writing, the knight, the chivalric knight, takes on the journey, takes on the adventure. I accept this adventure, and now I will seek, and my goal is the quest. So that in a way, the two concepts are connected, and they're both very interesting for Tolkien's kind of fiction, and conceptually, they link with the Old English word, which I mentioned, Beowulf's Sith, Beowulf's journey. Sith means a journey or an experience. And so we have this kind of constellation of ideas, a journey or an experience. It is something that you have to accept and existentially and take on. And then you must follow the journey until you reach the goal of your quest. So I think these ideas can be seen to be connected together and you can apply them very well to Tolkien's fiction.
Thank you. We have another question for both of you. Do you believe that the fall of kings in Tolkien's books can be interpreted as the fall of society as a whole, or it can be seen as a way for a society to be reborn?
Thomas, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first? Is Thomas still there?
Onegar is disconnected.
Okay,
So it's for you.
it's all for me. So the fall of kings. Is this supposed to be the end of society, or is this the moment for a new start? I wonder which fall of kings you're thinking of. At the end of The Lord of the Rings, the king is very much restored to his throne. Aragorn becomes the king, and a new age sets in. And the people who leave this new age are the elves. They leave Middle Earth, and uh, human beings seem to be taking over. Um, Certainly, when a king is absent from a society, this can cause problems. So, in a way, I'm not really sure that the person asking the question which fall of kings you are thinking of. In a way, the Lord of the Rings, the end of the Lord of the Rings is about a restoration of a king, a bit like the story in English history. We had a republic for a short period under Oliver Cromwell, and then and the king was executed. Charles I was executed, but the republic failed, and there was a restoration, and King Charles II returned to become King of England once again. Things had changed, of course. Parliament now had a little more power to assert itself against the king. I think there are political messages in Tolkien, but not political allegories as such. Tolkien tried to avoid having too many political allegories in his story. But the Lord, as it has been pointed out several times, the Lord of the Rings was written around the same time as George Orwell wrote his political allegories, such as Animal Farm, where you have a political story disguised as a story about a farm where the animals take over. And everything works well at first, but it doesn't work so well later when people abuse their power. And a similar kind of political story seems to happen in The Lord of the Rings at the end when they return to the Shire, when the hobbits return to the Shire, they find that evil men have taken power in the Shire and are running the Shire. And it turns out that it's Sharky Saruman, the wizard, has moved to the Shire and is trying to use his power to rule the Shire instead of the kind of what kind of society is the Shire where the hobbits live? It's almost a kind of republic where the king is absent but half recognized as a kindly, friendly influence away from them, and they have their own assemblies, and everything is run by a semi-democratic kind of society. So I'm reluctant to give too many political interpretations, but I can see that there are ways of doing this. And Tolkien talked about application of political ideas to his stories rather than allegory, where everything has a very clear black and white meaning. I hope that answers your question.
I hope so. It wasn't my question, so I don't know. It came by mail. I
Yes.
because it was exhaustive. I have another question. It's for you because we haven't got Thomas yet. Um, and it is between Beowulf and the other medieval novels. Who is, for Tolkien, the ideal knight?
Who is the ideal knight in medieval literature or in? Yes, this is an interesting question. It's a bit like saying, which is your favorite uh, pop group from the 1970s or the 60s? It's hard to decide, really, who to choose from. Um, what you find, what is interesting, I suppose we have to take Aragorn from the Lord of the Rings, from Tolkien's fiction, as somehow the ideal knight. In in the in the meaning of knights that we were using, or that Thomas Honegger was using in his talk. So not so much the late medieval chivalric knight, but an early medieval knight who has many ideals, who is very honorable, who keeps to his word, who is not selfish. Um, what is interesting, though, is that Tolkien had different thoughts about Beowulf. Beowulf is a good knight, if you like, or a good warrior in the first half of the story. The first half of the stories is Beowulf goes on an adventure, a journey, a quest, Denmark. He arrives in Denmark. He kills the monster Grendel. He cleanses Denmark of the monsters, and he is rewarded by the king of Denmark. Beowulf was a young man. This is a good behavior for a young man. But if you behave like this when you are old, when you are king of a country, so in the second half of Beowulf, 50 years later, Beowulf is an old man. He is king of Geatland, and a dragon is now attacking his kingdom, like in The Hobbit. How should you behave? Should you behave like a young hero, like a young knight, and take on the journey, take on the adventure, go on your own to fight the dragon and to cleanse the country of the monster, the dragon? I think Tolkien thinks this is irresponsible behavior for a king. The king has a different responsibility to a young hero. A young hero, in a way, can be almost egotistical, almost selfish, because they want to prove themselves, to prove himself as a knight, to make his name famous, to make your name famous. But a king has other responsibilities. He must be a protector of his people. He must protect his country from enemies. If he goes out fighting dragons on his own, this is irresponsible. And it's not clear at the end of Beowulf whether Beowulf is being criticized as a king for irresponsible behavior. The poet leaves this question open, and we have to decide as readers what we think. And Tolkien argued the same thing about the Battle of Maldon. And Thomas already advertised my book on the Battle of Maldon, so I think it's okay for me to mention it now. So my recent book is called The Battle of Maldon, War and Peace in 10th Century England. And in the first chapter, in the introduction, I discuss Tolkien's ideas, because Tolkien thinks that the leader of the English, and they're fighting the Vikings, is also a little irresponsible. And so I found myself disagreeing with the great professor. So if you want to look at that debate, um, then you can see the pros and cons. Is Beartnoth? Beartnoth is the hero of the Battle of Maldon. He is a kind of prince. He is a leader of the English. He's an old man. Is he irresponsible in fighting the Vikings the way he does? Have a look at the poem. Have a look at the book and see if you believe Tolkien. Do you agree with Tolkien, or do you agree with Atherton? That's the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ci sono altre domande? Se non ci sono altre domande, I think that we should thank Professor.
Thank you very much for your hospitality.
There is actual people in front of me.
I heard them. Yeah, I can hear them.
Okay. I leave the word to Lorenzo, which will close the whole session. So I think he will speak in Italian, the whole conference. There is also Honegger Okay, so we can.
Back again. Sorry. I made a Bilbo, kind of. I made a Bilbo. I just disappeared a bit. Yeah.
You came just in time for the closing, and
Oh.
thank you for the greetings. We're very sorry about the connection. Yes. So
Has anyone got any other question for Thomas Honecker before we finish?
yes, I could repeat some of the questions for Thomas. So the last two questions. So one moment. All right. Do you believe that the fall of kings in Tolkien's books can be interpreted as the fall of society as a whole, or if that can be seen as a way for a society to be reborn?
The fall of kings.
Yes.
Of kings. I think Tolkien reborn. I would maybe not talk about rebirth, rejuvenation, maybe. I mean, you have a strong continuum. Tolkien's kind of changes, they are not so much revolutionary, unless, of course, you have something like the downfall of Numenor of Numenor. But otherwise, you have this kind of continuation. If you look at Aragorn, what he does, he is a renovator imperii. He's like Charlemagne. He doesn't say, I'm making a new empire, but he says, I'm bringing back the good old times. And often you have this idea. So individuals might fall down, but the institution kind of continues. And in that, I think Tolkien is more or less in harmony with what Kantorowicz in the 1950s kind of postulated in his book, The Two Bodies of the King. That in the Middle Ages, you have this concept that develops that the king has two bodies, also the queen, of course. But let's say the king. The king has its physical body, which is frail, which has its mortality, and which in the end will pass away. But at the same time, the king has this kind of transcendent body that will, so to speak, reincarnate, you could almost say. That's why the king is dead, long live the king. You say, wait a moment, he is dead. What does it mean now? How can he live long? No, it's this second body, this transcendental aspect that passes on to the next body, you could say. And to some extent, I see something similar in Tolkien's idea of kingship there. Yeah. I just outed myself as a monarchist, so to speak. I am Swiss, I must say. I'm not a monarch, kind of.
Thank you. We have another question while you were away. Between Beowulf and the other medieval novels, who is, for Tolkien, the ideal knight?
Beowulf and the others. Well, you don't have so much of a choice in Anglo-Saxon poetry, if I'm not completely mistaken. I mean, basically, it's Beowulf. Everything else is kind of, biblical. You have the Battle of Malden, a few other kind of semi-historical poems, and he wasn't obviously very fond of Berchtolf. He was looking at it critically, so it's basically Beowulf. Maybe you could say next to Beowulf, we have a kind of a Sam figure in Wiglaf, who gives him a helping hand killing the dragon, and who becomes the successor. But otherwise, not much choice. Sorry. Mark, do you have anything?
I said that the young Beowulf.
Oh, the young Beowulf, okay.
The young Beowulf was, I mean, a slightly different take. The young Beowulf is a good knight. The old Beowulf is maybe irresponsible, fighting the dragon. He should be more responsible for his kingdom and his people. And possibly Tolkien thought that as well, it seems. But interesting parallel with Beowulf and Wiglaf. Yeah, the two together against. Hmm.
Indeed. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Ok, se non ci sono altre domande, ok, this time I really leave the word to Lorenzo, which closes your convention.
Allora, prima di tutto ringrazio tantissimo tutti i nostri relatori che ci hanno permesso di fare questo viaggio all'interno della poetica di Tolkien. I wish to thank all the lecturers who made this convention possible and guide us through Tolkien's poetry. È stato veramente grandioso vedere come siete riusciti ad approcciarvi da tantissimi punti di vista, filologico, artistico, semiotico, storico e poetico. It amazed us the way each one of you was able to give us a different point of view, philological, artistic, semiotic, historical, poetic. Speriamo di poter continuare questo cammino nei prossimi anni, sicuri che Tolkien ci guiderà lui stesso alle risposte che cerchiamo. Come diceva all'inizio Claudio Testi, guardiamo il testo. We hope we'll be able to keep walking on this path in the years to come, certain that Tolkien himself will guide us to the answer we are looking for. As Claudio Testi said yesterday, we have to keep looking at the text. Ringrazio quindi tutti. Roberto Arduini, Roberta Tosi, Claudio Testi, Luca Manini, che purtroppo è dovuto tornare nella sua patria, cioè a casa sua, Simone Bonechi, and finally, I really wish to thank Mark Atherton and Thomas Onegger for their presence. Ringrazio tutti voi che avete partecipato a questo convegno, ringrazio i nostri tecnici Mattia, Luigi e Andrea, grandi. Ringrazio l'Università degli Studi di Milano per il patrocinio e l'Associazione Italiana di Studi Tolkieniani per la loro collaborazione. Ringrazio infine i miei due colleghi, Agnese Guardigli e Paolo Zampieri, per avermi supportato nelle ultime settimane e nei mesi scorsi. Grazie a tutti e buona serata.